Before we begin this incredible true story, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss another amazing story like this one. The helicopter blades chopped through the thick Afghan air as Captain Sarah Mitchell gripped her medical bag tighter. She had been a combat medic for 3 years, but something felt different about this mission. The intel was shaky, the coordinates kept changing, and her team seemed more nervous than usual. They were heading into a remote village where insurgents had reportedly taken hostages. Her job was simple: save lives and get out. As they flew over the barren mountains, Sarah looked at the faces of her fellow soldiers. There was Lieutenant James Parker, the team leader who always cracked jokes to ease the tension. Beside him sat Corporal Danny Rice, barely 22 years old, writing what looked like a letter to someone back home. In the corner, Sergeant Maria Santos cleaned her rifle for the 3rd time, her jaw set in concentration. They had all trained together, bled together, and trusted each other with their lives. The landing zone appeared suddenly, a dusty clearing surrounded by mud brick buildings that looked abandoned. As soon as their boots hit the ground, Sarah felt her stomach turn. The silence was too complete, too perfect. No children playing, no animals, no signs of life anywhere. Lieutenant Parker raised his fist, signaling everyone to stop and listen. For 30 seconds, they stood frozen, scanning windows and rooftops for any movement. Then the world exploded. Gunfire erupted from every direction, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkened doorways like deadly fireflies. Sarah dropped to her knees behind a crumbling wall as bullets kicked up dust clouds around her. She could hear Parker shouting orders, but his words were swallowed by the constant crack of weapons. Someone screamed for a medic. Her training kicked in before her fear could stop her. She ran toward the voice, keeping low, her bag bouncing against her hip. Corporal Rice was down, blood spreading across his shoulder. Sarah pulled him behind cover and started working, her hands steady despite the chaos. She packed the wound, applied pressure, and gave him something for the pain. His eyes were wide with shock, but he nodded when she told him he would be okay. That was the moment she heard Parker screaming into his radio, his voice cracking with desperation. The extraction helicopter had been hit. It was going down 3 kilometers away. They were being overrun, outnumbered by at least 20 to 1. Parker made the hardest decision of his life in that moment. He ordered an immediate retreat to a secondary extraction point 2 kilometers north. Everyone started moving, dragging the wounded, firing as they fell back. Sarah stayed with Rice, helping him stumble through the narrow alleyways. Behind them, Santos provided covering fire, her rifle barking in short, controlled bursts. They reached a bombed-out building where Parker said they would regroup. Sarah counted heads as everyone piled through the broken doorway. 7 soldiers had made it, including 2 wounded. They barricaded the entrance with whatever they could find: furniture, rubble, even an old cart. Parker got back on the radio, calling for emergency extraction, giving their new coordinates. The response made everyone's blood run cold. No helicopters were available for at least 4 hours. They were trapped deep in enemy territory with ammunition, running low, and the enemy closing in from all sides. Night fell fast in the Afghan mountains, and with it came a cold that cut through their uniforms like knives. Sarah worked by the dim light of a red-filtered flashlight, checking vitals and changing bandages. Rice's shoulder wound had stopped bleeding, but he was running a fever. The other wounded soldier, Private Mike Chen, had taken shrapnel to his leg. Sarah had removed what she could, but without proper surgical tools. Some fragments would have to stay until they reached a field hospital. Parker set up a watch rotation. 2 soldiers on guard at all times while the others rested, but nobody really slept. Every sound outside made them grip their weapons tighter. Footsteps, voices speaking in Pashto, the distant rumble of vehicles. The enemy knew they were somewhere in this area, and they were searching systematically, building by building. Santos whispered that she counted at least 30 hostiles in the streets, maybe more. They were like rats in a trap, and the walls were closing in. Around midnight, Sarah volunteered for watch duty. She took position by a window that overlooked a narrow street, her rifle feeling heavy in her hands. She had fired weapons in training hundreds of times, but but she had never actually shot at another human being. Medics were supposed to save lives, not take them. But tonight she knew that distinction might not matter. If they came through that door, she would do whatever it took to protect her team. Hours crawled by like wounded animals. Every minute felt like 10. Every shadow looked like an enemy fighter. Sarah's eyes burned from staring into the darkness, trying to separate real threats from her imagination. Then, just before dawn, she heard it. The unmistakable sound of a helicopter in the distance. Her heart leaped. Parker heard it too, and immediately got on the radio. But the response crushed their hopes. The helicopter was not for them. It was a medical evacuation for another unit 15 kilometers away, as first light broke over the mountains. Their situation became crystal clear. They were surrounded. Parker gathered everyone together and laid out their options. They could try to fight their way to the extraction point. But with 2 wounded soldiers and low ammunition, their chances were almost zero. They could stay and hope for rescue, but the building would not hold against a determined assault. Or they could try to blend in, hide among the civilian population, and move in small groups. None of the options were good. That was when they heard the engines. 3 trucks full of armed fighters pulled into the street below. Someone must have spotted them during the night and reported their location. Parker made a split-second decision. They would make a run for it through the back of the building, into a maze of alleyways that might give them a chance. Everyone grabbed their gear. Santos helped Chen to his feet while Sarah supported Rice. They moved fast and quiet, slipping out through a collapsed wall into the pre-dawn shadows. Behind them, they heard shouting and the crash of doors being kicked in. The enemy had entered the building. Parker led them through a twisting route he had memorized from the maps. Left, right, through a courtyard, under a low archway. Sarah's lungs burned as she half-carried Rice, his weight dragging on her shoulder. Her medical bag kept snagging on corners, but she refused to leave it behind. They emerged onto a wider street, and that was their mistake. A fighter spotted them from a rooftop and opened fire. Bullets stitched across the ground, and everyone scattered. Sarah dove behind a water trough, pulling Rice down with her. When she looked up, her blood went ice cold. The team had been split. Parker, Santos, and 3 others had made it across the street and disappeared into another alley. But Sarah, Rice, Chen, and a young private named Tommy Bradford were cut off, pinned down by fire from multiple positions. Tommy Bradford was crying not from fear, but from a bullet wound in his side. Sarah crawled to him, dragging her medical bag through the dirt. The wound was bad, very bad. The bullet had gone clean through, but it had torn through intestines on the way. Without immediate surgery, Tommy would die in hours, maybe less. She packed the wound as best she could, giving him morphine to dull the pain. His hand gripped hers with desperate strength as he whispered about his mom, his girlfriend. His kid sister's graduation he was supposed to attend next month. Rice was on the other side of the water trough, firing short bursts at the rooftops to keep the enemy's heads down. Chen had propped himself against the wall, his injured leg stretched out in front of him, but his rifle was up and ready. They were 3.5 soldiers against an army, and they all knew how this would end. Sarah could hear Parker's voice on the radio, frantic, trying to coordinate something, anything. He was ordering them to hold position, to stay alive, that he would come back for them. But then the radio crackled with different orders. Higher command had gotten on the line. They told Parker to proceed to the extraction point immediately. The helicopter would only wait 10 minutes, and if they missed it, there would not be another chance. Parker argued, his voice breaking with emotion. He could not leave soldiers behind. He would not. But the voice on the radio was cold and clear. He had 5 other soldiers with him who could still be saved. He had a duty to get them out. The mission was over. He had to move now. Sarah heard every word through her own radio, and she felt her world collapse. They were being abandoned. Left behind enemy lines with 2 critically wounded soldiers and almost no ammunition. Parker was still arguing, still refusing, but Santos took the radio from him. Sarah could hear her old friend's voice, steady, despite the tears she must have been crying. Santos told them to find cover, to hide, to survive until they could send help. She promised they would not forget them. She promised they would come back. Then the radio went silent. Rice looked at Sarah with hollow eyes. They both knew what Santos's promises meant. In this part of Afghanistan, surrounded by hostile forces with the enemy actively hunting them, help would not come in time. If it came at all, it would be to recover bodies, not rescue living soldiers. Tommy was fading fast, his breathing shallow and rapid. Chen's leg was bleeding again, soaking through the bandages Sarah had applied earlier, and the gunfire was getting closer, more organized. As the enemy tightened their circle, Sarah made a decision in that moment that would define the rest of her life. She told Rice and Chen to take Tommy and find a place to hide, somewhere deep and dark where the enemy might not think to look. She would draw the fighters away, lead them on a chase through the streets, buy the others time to get to safety. Rice immediately refused. They would not split up. They would not leave her. But Sarah pulled rank, using her captain's authority for perhaps the first time in her life. This was not a debate. This was an order. She gave them her medical bag, keeping only her rifle and 2 magazines. She gave them her radio so they could call for help if they got a chance. She gave them her water and most of her ammunition. And then, before they could stop her, she stepped out from behind the water trough and started running. She fired her rifle in the air, shouting, making herself the biggest target possible. Every fighter on that street immediately turned toward her. The chase began. Sarah ran like she had never run before, her boots pounding on ancient cobblestones, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Bullets whipped past her head, sparking off walls, kicking up dust at her heels. She turned corners at random, having no idea where she was going, knowing only that she had to keep moving, keep drawing them away from her wounded soldiers. Behind her, she could hear shouting, the sound of many feet, trucks starting up to cut her off. She ducked into a narrow passage between 2 buildings. So tight, she had to turn sideways to fit through. The walls scraped her shoulders, and she could smell garbage and rot. But it opened into a small courtyard with several doors. She tried the first one, locked. The second one, locked. The third door gave way, and she stumbled into darkness. Her eyes took a moment to adjust, and she realized she was in someone's home. A very old woman sat in the corner, wrapped in layers of colorful fabric, staring at Sarah with eyes that had seen too much war. The woman did not scream or call out. She just watched as Sarah moved through the room, checking for other exits. There was a back door, but it led to another dead-end alley. Sarah was trapped. She could hear the fighters outside, searching the courtyard, kicking doors, getting closer. Her rifle had maybe 20 rounds left. She could make a stand here, take as many with her as possible. Or she could surrender and hope. They would take her prisoner instead of executing her on the spot. The old woman stood up slowly, her joints cracking with age. She shuffled across the room and pulled aside a woven rug, revealing a wooden trapdoor in the floor. She gestured urgently for Sarah to get down there. Sarah hesitated, wondering if this was a trap, if the woman was loyal to the fighters and was hiding her for them to find. But the woman's eyes held something that transcended politics and war. They held basic human compassion. One woman helping another in desperate need. Sarah descended into the darkness, and the woman closed the trapdoor above her, replacing the rug. The space was tiny, barely big enough to curl up in, smelling of earth and potatoes. It must have been a food cellar, carved out of the rocky ground beneath the house. Sarah heard boots stomping on the floor above her head, voices shouting questions at the old woman. The woman's responses were in Pashto, but the tone was clear. She was annoyed at being disturbed, insisting she was alone, demanding they leave her house. There was more stomping, things being knocked over, and then finally, the boots moved away. Sarah stayed in that hole for hours, not daring to move, barely daring to breathe. Her muscles cramped in the confined space, and her mind raced with worry about Rice. Chen and Tommy. Had they found a hiding place? Was Tommy still alive? Had the fighters found them? She would never forgive herself if they had been captured or killed because she had left them. But she had to believe her sacrifice had meant something, that they were safe, that help would come for them. When the trapdoor finally opened, Sarah nearly screamed. But it was the old woman, alone, holding a cup of water and a piece of flatbread. Sarah climbed out, her legs barely supporting her weight after being folded up for so long. The woman gestured for her to eat and drink, then pointed out the window. It was full night again. Sarah had been hiding for almost 12 hours. The street outside was empty now. Fighters had moved their search to other parts of the village. The woman touched Sarah's arm and pointed to the eastern mountains, making walking motions with her fingers. She was telling Sarah to go, to leave while she had the chance to head east where she might find safety. Sarah wanted to thank her, wanted to ask why she had risked her life for an enemy soldier. But there was no common language between them, only the universal understanding that some things transcended war. Sarah touched her hand to her heart, then to the woman's heart. Hoping the gesture conveyed her gratitude, she slipped out into the night, moving like a ghost through shadows. Without a map, without a radio, without any real plan, she started walking east. The mountains loomed ahead, dark and forbidding. She had no idea how far she would have to go, how long she could survive on her own, or what waited for her out there in the wilderness. But she was alive, and that meant there was still hope. Hope that her soldiers had survived. Hope that she would find her way home. Hope that this nightmare would eventually end. The first night in the mountains nearly killed her. Sarah had trained in cold weather survival, but training and reality were very different things. The temperature dropped below freezing, and her uniform was designed for desert heat, not mountain cold. She found a shallow cave, really just an overhang of rock, and huddled there, shivering so hard her teeth rattled. She had no fire, no blanket, nothing but her own body heat. She did jumping jacks and push-ups until exhaustion forced her to stop, then curled into a ball and waited for dawn. When the sun finally rose, Sarah assessed her situation honestly. She had no food, no water, no navigation equipment, and no idea where she was going. The smart thing would be to stay put, find a good hiding spot, and wait for rescue. But something deep in her gut told her that rescue was not coming, not in time. She needed to move, to find civilization, to get help for Rice Chen and Tommy, who were still back there somewhere, hiding, hoping, dying. She walked all day, following ridgelines east, trying to stay on high ground where she could see in all directions. Her training told her to avoid villages, to assume everyone was hostile. But by the second day, her need for water became desperate. She could survive weeks without food, but only days without water. She watched a small village from a distance, studying the patterns. Women went to a well in the morning, children played in the afternoon, men gathered in the evening. She waited until late at night, then crept down to the well, filled her empty canteen, and disappeared back into the mountains before dawn. On the third day, she saw helicopters in the distance, flying search patterns. Her heart soared, and she waved her arms, tried to signal them. But they were too far away, and she had nothing bright enough to catch their attention. She watched them fly away, and a piece of her hope flew away with them. On the fourth day, the helicopters did not come back. On the fifth day, she began to accept that she might die out here, alone in these mountains, and no one would ever know what happened to her. Hunger became her constant companion, gnawing at her insides, making her weak and lightheaded. She tried eating berries from bushes, but they made her violently sick. She tried catching fish in a stream with her bare hands, but they were too fast. She found some kind of root vegetable and ate it raw, and it stayed down, giving her just enough energy to keep moving. Her boots were falling apart, her uniform was torn and filthy, and her body was covered in cuts, bruises, and insect bites. On the seventh day, she saw smoke rising from a valley below. Not the black smoke of burning buildings or warfare, but the white smoke of cooking fires. It was a small village, isolated and peaceful looking. Sarah knew this was a terrible risk. She could be walking into a nest of Taliban fighters. But she was out of options. Without help, she would not survive another week. She observed the village for hours from the hills above, and something about it felt different. There were women walking freely, without being completely covered. There were children playing openly. Maybe, just maybe, this was one of the rare places where foreigners were not automatically enemies. She waited until evening, then walked slowly down the mountain path, her hands held out to show she was unarmed. Her rifle was gone, lost when she slipped crossing a stream 3 days ago. A young boy saw her first and ran screaming to get the adults. Within minutes, Sarah was surrounded by villagers, all talking at once, pointing, arguing about what to do with her. An older man who seemed to be the village elder pushed through the crowd and studied her with sharp, intelligent eyes. He spoke some broken English, learned from American soldiers who had helped them build a school years ago. Sarah tried to explain her situation, but words were inadequate. She showed him her dog tags, her torn uniform, the medical insignia on her shoulder. She mimed being abandoned, walking for days, needing help. The elder looked at her for a long moment, and Sarah could see him weighing the danger of helping her against the moral obligation of hospitality. In Afghan culture, guests were sacred, even enemy guests. To turn her away would dishonor his village. To help her might bring retribution from the Taliban. The elder made his decision. He took Sarah to his own home, where his wife and daughters brought her food, water, and clean clothes. They tended to her wounds, gave her a place to sleep, and asked nothing in return. Sarah cried for the first time since being abandoned, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness from people who had every reason to hate her. The elder's wife held her while she sobbed, patting her back and murmuring soft words in Pashto that needed no translation. For 2 days, Sarah rested and regained her strength. The elder sent messages through trusted contacts, trying to find a way to get her back to American forces. It was dangerous and complicated. The Taliban controlled most of the roads. Any hint that the village was helping an American soldier would result in savage punishment. But the elder was connected to a network of people who remembered when Americans had built schools and hospitals, who believed in helping others regardless of politics. On the 3rd morning, the elder told Sarah that transportation had been arranged. A truck would come at night, supposedly carrying supplies, but she would be hidden under the cargo. It would take her to a town near the Pakistani border, where NATO forces sometimes patrolled. From there, she would be on her own to make contact. It was the best they could do, and Sarah was grateful beyond words. That night, as promised, a battered truck arrived. Sarah hugged the elder's wife, touched her forehead to the foreheads of the children who had brought her food, and thanked the elder in her broken Pashto. He pressed something into her hand, a simple compass, old and scratched but functional. He pointed east and said one word, home. Sarah climbed into the truck bed, and they covered her with burlap sacks and boxers. The journey was rough and terrifying, every checkpoint a potential discovery.
Ow.
Every stop a moment where she held her breath and prayed. 12 hours later, the truck stopped, and the driver thumped on the side twice. Sarah emerged in the early dawn to find herself on the outskirts of a larger town. The driver pointed to a hill where she could see vehicles, military vehicles. He would not go closer, could not risk being seen. Sarah started walking toward those vehicles, and with each step her hope grew stronger. She was limping, exhausted, and barely recognizable as a soldier. But she was alive. The NATO patrol spotted her first, weapons raised, shouting for her to identify herself. Sarah raised her hands and croaked out her name, rank, and unit. They surrounded her, disbelieving, calling it in on their radios. Captain Sarah Mitchell was listed as missing in action, presumed dead. Her appearance was like seeing a ghost. They gave her water, wrapped her in blankets, and drove her to the nearest base, where medics checked her over while intelligence officers peppered her with questions. Sarah told them everything, but what she cared about most was Rice, Chen, Tommy, and Bradford. What had happened to them? The officers exchanged glances and her heart sank. They took her to a quiet room and gave her the news as gently as possible. Rice and Chen had been found 5 days after Sarah led the enemy away. They had hidden in an old cistern, barely big enough for 2 people plus Tommy's body, because yes, Tommy Bradford had died from his wounds within hours of Sarah leaving. But Rice and Chen had survived, had been rescued by a special operations team that came back for them despite the risks. They were alive, recovering at a military hospital in Germany, asking about her every day. Parker and Santos and the others had made it out on the original extraction. They had fought to come back, had volunteered for the rescue mission, had never stopped pushing for someone to find their lost soldiers. When Sarah was finally allowed to video call Rice and Chen, all 3 of them cried. Rice told her that her sacrifice had saved them, that drawing the enemy away had given them time to find that cistern and hide. Chen said they had never lost faith that she would survive somehow, that she was too stubborn to die in some Afghan village. Sarah spent 2 weeks being debriefed and medically cleared before they sent her home. She arrived at Dover Air Force Base on a cold November morning, and her family was there waiting. Her mother collapsed in her arms, sobbing, unable to believe her daughter was really alive. The story of her survival spread through the military community, and people called it a miracle. But Sarah knew the truth. It was not a miracle. It was the kindness of strangers, the sacrifice of soldiers who looked after each other, and the stubborn human will to survive. She was awarded medals, commended for bravery, offered promotions and interviews. But Sarah wanted none of it. She left the military a year later and went to work for a nonprofit that helped refugees. She never forgot the old woman who hid her, the elder who risked his village to help her, or the truck driver who drove her towards safety. And she never forgot that in the darkest moments of war, when everything seems lost and humanity seems dead, there are still people who choose kindness over fear, compassion over hate, and hope over despair. That was the real miracle.